Hello, I'm Rick Cochran, and welcome to Books in the World, a production of the Cape Cod Writers Center and Cape Cod Community Access Channel. Our goal is to show how writers, illustrators, publishers, editors, and others in the literary field play their roles in the world of books and other media. The Cape Cod Writers Center was established 57 years ago, and Books in the World has been broadcasting continuously for 41 years. We sponsor a 4-day conference at the beginning of August every summer. And today we're delighted to welcome Tim Weed. Tim was actually one of our instructors this summer. I had the pleasure of taking a course with him, and it was outstanding. You did a great job, Tim.
Thank you.
So let me tell you a little bit about yourself.
Okay.
Tim is a novelist, lecturer, outdoorsman, and independent scholar. His short story fiction collection, A Field Guide to Murder and Fly Fishing, made the 2018 Eric Hoffer Book Award Grand Prize shortlist. His YA novel, Whirlpool's Island, was named to Bank Street College's list of the best books of 2014. Tim also is kind of a diverse field. He serves on the core faculty of the Newport MFA in Creative Writing program, and is an instructor at Grub Street Creative Writing Center in Boston. He's a winner of the Writer's Digest Popular Fiction Award and the Solar Best Travel Writing Award. He has a parallel career in international education as the co-founder of the Cuba Writers Program, and Tim is a featured expert for National Geographic expeditions in Cuba, Spain, Portugal, Patagonia, and Tierra del Fuego. So the first question, of course, is what do you do in your spare time? But
Got to make a living.
Tell us a little bit about your background and how these things all fit together and inspire your writing and your teaching and your, guiding.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this a little bit on the way down, and when I was, my parents were young academics and had traveled around quite a bit as a kid, and so I was always the perpetual new kid on the block. And when I was 6, I actually wrote an epic novel about an otter called Ottaga that was 11 pages long. And so that kind of launched my writing career. But also I was traveling, we traveled a lot, and it's always been a part of my life. And so, and as I kind of mentioned half jokingly before, writers in this day and age have to make a living. So I've had this parallel career in international education. I was directing college semester abroad programs and working with a lot of student travel programs and with National Geographic and things like that. And so this is the way it's just fit together with me, for me in my life, has been writing and education, and particularly education based in a lot of travel. So it's a
Tell us, I really enjoyed Whirlpool's Island. We'll talk about the novel first. I know it was mentioned that it kind of grew out of your exploring your own ancestry, your colonial ancestors and Native American ancestors. How did that come about?
Well, so I really wanted to write a novel. I had gotten my MFA. I had written a lot of short fiction, but I really wanted to write a novel because novels were the thing. I had mentioned that I was the perpetual new kid in the block, and novels were the thing that really gave me a lot of solace and a form of escape and a way to also, I think, sort of an antidote to loneliness. And so I wanted to write a novel, and I was really interested in family history. I had some ancestry that had, early English settlers on the Connecticut coast. So I was doing a lot of research on that. I also have some Native American ancestry. And so it struck me, the 17th century in New England struck me as a really interesting time, and I kind of started to immerse myself in the history. And that led to the creation of Whirlpool's Island. But it was a lot of research getting there. So a lot of the research that I was doing was very dry. You read the travelers' accounts from the 17th century, you read a lot of anthropological studies and historical studies, but it's all very dry. And so in order to, and as you know, in order to write a novel, it has to feel very, very much alive. And so I was trying to figure out how to make that happen. And so I was visiting things like the Plymouth Plantation and the Pequot Museum, and really trying to sort of squint away all those centuries of time between the 21st century and the 17th century. But what really did it for me, I think, what really allowed me to bridge that gap was the realization that nature is sort of the bridge and between the present and the past. And so I spent a lot of time out on small boats in the ocean and walking through the forest. And the forests in New England are very much now are more like they were then than they have been since. I mean, the forest has really come back in a big way. And so it was nature was the thing that allowed me to kind of visualize it and make that leap, and the story began to feel alive. And that's sort of how I started writing the novel.
I think one of the things that struck me was the obvious clash of the cultures. Tell us a little bit about your three, as I saw, three major protagonists: the governor and Will Poole and Squamosset.
Yeah. So Will Poole is a young man, a young Englishman who he sort of chafes against the strictures or the restrictions of his society. This is a Puritan society. He feels, as many adolescents do, he feels kind of restricted. And he also, at the same time, is having some kind of uncanny hallucinations that are leading him to feel uneasy. And so he's out hunting outside the walls. It's a walled village that there lives, sort of a village at the edge of the great North American wilderness. And he's walking outside the wall hunting, and he runs into a Wampanoag elder, Squamosset, who is very strange. He has a way of kind of showing up unexpectedly and disappearing unexpectedly. There's some strange things about it. But they end up forming a relationship, and this is something that is not okay with the Puritan fathers of the community, including Governor Rockingham, who's sort of he is the head proprietor of this small village. And so that ends up kind of setting in motion a series of events that lead to some crises and actually lead to a quest, and they end up going on it's kind of, I consider it kind of a literary adventure story, in which Will's relationship with Squamosset kind of opens him up to possibilities for life that he wouldn't have expected, being a young Puritan boy in colonial New England. And it is a story that has sort of supernatural elements and things like that.
Yeah, I was struck throughout your writing of how you, in many of your pieces, including your short stories, there's a mystical or mysticism element to it, which you worked in very nicely. How do you? I guess the other thing that I really noticed was. Many of your protagonists are the classic kind of outsider, loner, seeking, if they aren't coming of age, they're seeking their place in some way.
Yeah.
Of course, none of us are autobiographical in our writing, right? But maybe you could talk a little bit about, how that fits with your writing.
Yeah, so, it's interesting. I mentioned before that I was, as a young kid, I was moving around a lot. My parents were moving, we were always moving. And so I was the perpetual new kid on the block. And as such, I did spend a lot of time alone. And I've thought about this a little bit. I do think that is something that is a part of my fiction. And the outsider element, of course, is a solitary protagonist reacting against a society or out in nature trying to survive. And for me, I think it is a theme that keeps coming back, and mostly this theme of solitude, partly because it has been part of my life. It was part of my formation, but also I think that one of the reasons that fiction, I think, is such a powerful art form and isn't going anywhere. One of the reasons I think fiction will never be supplanted by movies or by virtual reality is that fiction is the art that allows us to inhabit the consciousness of another human being. And in the end, we're all alone, really. I mean, we go through our lives alone, even if we're surrounded by family. But reading a good novel or a good story allows you to experience the world of the story from inside a consciousness that's not your own. And so in that way, fiction is a great antidote to loneliness. And it was that for me as a reader, and it was also, and that's sort of one of my goals as a writer. And I think that's you know, somewhat why solitude is sort of a theme of my fiction.
Your short stories, which we should go into as well, the Field Guide to Murder and Fly Fishing,
Yeah.
which is an interesting juxtaposition.
Yeah.
They're set in exotic locations, they're set in local locations in New Hampshire, Vermont. You follow in one story the Grateful Dead, and maybe to what extent does location play, and how do you get into the locations of your stories?
Well, place is really important to me, and I think for a couple of reasons. One is just because it is a reflection of my life, you know, that I have ended up traveling a lot. And so to some degree, I mean, you mentioned, is fiction autobiographical? And for me at least, and at least with the stories, it is autobiographical to the extent that the story builds off of something that happened. But in fiction, what fiction allows you to do is to take it to the logical conclusion in a way that you wouldn't be able to in life. So a situation presents itself, and in life you kind of notice it and you're like, oh, that's interesting. But in fiction, you can really follow it. And you can say, okay, well, what were to happen if? And so a lot of my stories are based on, or autobiographical as points of departure. But the sense of place comes in, not only because I have spent time in a lot of these places, but also because I think that for me, you know, again, when I was young, and this idea that literature has been so important to me is because I feel transported. And so when I write fiction, that's also the goal, is transportation. And I really think that place or description is a huge part of that. One of the things that really leads to fictional transportation, the being immersed in a story. And so if my stories are set in unusual locations culturally, or foreign countries, or wilderness locations, part of that is just the idea that in order to bring a setting like this alive, you really have to use the kind of descriptive detail that transports the reader into the story. And so I think that's a practical sense, that most of my stories don't take place in a suburban kitchen, for example, or a 7-Eleven, which is a place that everybody knows, and so you don't have to describe. So a lot of the places that I use, I sort of gravitate to places that do require description, because I think that's kind of a transportive element of fiction.
One of the things I'm intrigued with is novel versus short story. And I've done short stories, but they were sort of memoir, anecdotal.
Yeah.
You know, some of the differences, or why a novel or why a short story?
Well, I got into writing because of novels, and novels were the thing that really, you know, they did provide that long-term escape, that sense of living in a different world. And so that's always been my goal, is to write novels. But short stories, so in a way, the short stories were a way for me to teach myself how to write fiction, because there's less at stake in a short story. You can work with you're working with a smaller canvas. But in the process of writing them and reading some good short stories, I really came to appreciate short fiction as an art form, because there's nothing can be wasted. Everything has to add up, and it has to enact something in a relatively small piece of real estate. You know, and so I think that writing a short story in some ways is more challenging than writing a novel, and because it has to be right. And so I have written many failed short stories, and I think that's natural, because it's really hard to get right. So I appreciate both, but now my focus is what it always has been, which is really on producing novels. Yeah.
How did you get involved with National Geographic and you know, the travel guide program? And
well, so I was a Spanish major back in college at Middlebury, and I studied abroad quite a bit, and I had lived abroad somewhat growing up, and so I had this attraction to foreign cultures. And I started working in student travel, and one thing led to another, especially in Spanish-speaking countries, but really all over the world. And I started directing college semester abroad programs in various countries. And then I got involved with National Geographic because I was one of the founding directors of a National Geographic student program. It's called National Geographic Student Expeditions. So I was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time and had a hand in creating these new programs, and that led to the association with National Geographic. And at the same time, I'd been spending a lot of time in Cuba, and this was around 2010, 2011, where people were really starting to get interested in going to Cuba, and I had a lot of contacts and a lot of knowledge there. So National Geographic said, "Oh, well, we have this association. Would you like to start participating in our programs as an expert?" What they call the featured expert, which is a title I don't really love because I don't consider myself an expert. I consider myself more of a student. But what I do is I go on these programs and I give a series of lectures on the history or biographical figures or whatever. So I do that. These days I do that less and less. I do that occasionally, 2 or 3 times a year.
When you're involved in these experiences, do you have conscious flashes of like, oh, that would make a good part of a story, or are there things that, consciously you think I got to work that into something?
Occasionally, what I try to do is I try to take notes. I carry a notebook, or these days I carry my smartphone and do the audio version, of sort of taking notes. But it's sensory details, as you know. That is the sort of lifeblood of fiction. And so what I really try to notice is what does a flock of birds look like as it's flying across the sky? What do things smell like? What do things look like? So that to me is a valuable thing to collect. And occasionally I will get an idea for a story. But as you know, like, ideas are kind of a dime a dozen. It's more the execution that's the issue.
Good point.
Yeah.
You're also very active as a teacher, and as I said, I had a chance to experience your teaching, which was excellent. And do you find that teaching helps you in your writing?
I do think so. I think there's a quote that I often use in my classes from Ingmar Bergman, the film director, who said something to the effect of, talking about the artistic process. He said, "I throw a spear out into the darkness. That is intuition. Then I send an army out into the darkness to retrieve the spear. That is intellect." And I really think that writers need to have both intuition and intellect. And intuition is when you're writing a first draft or when you're re-inhabiting a draft for a rewrite. And the intellect is really an understanding of the craft, so that you can be your own best editor. And between drafts, you can sort of apply yourself to say, how can I take this dream of this incredible intuitive vision that I'd had and turn it into something that comes alive in the mind of readers? And for me, that's where teaching comes in, is that it is a chance to really exercise that analytical side. And to study the craft and become well versed in aspects of the craft that you yourself struggle with. So for me, that's what. In addition to, I do just enjoy teaching for its own sake. I love working with other writers, but I do think that it's a way to hone the intellectual side of writing. That's helpful.
Do you have a set routine or a process, or how do you go about your writing? I know we all have different ways of doing it.
Everybody has a different process. I am one of those people who I try to write every single day, including holidays. There may be a few days of the year that I don't write, and that's usually when my mental state isn't up to it, because I've stayed out far too late the night before. But yes, I write every day. I tend to write first thing in the morning. Usually write a little bit before breakfast. I'll have breakfast, but I also don't have a huge attention span or the ability to exert a lot of energy for hours and hours. So what I'll do is I'll write, then I'll take a break to have breakfast. Then I'll go back and do another session of writing, and then I'll go out and ski in the woods. And then I'll come back and do another session of writing. And then, sometime after lunch, around 2 or 3 in the afternoon, I start to lose the ability to focus on writing at all. And that's when I start doing things like answering emails or, reading student papers or something that, to me, the writing comes first because that's the sacred thing. That's the thing that requires, your best and your clearest form of attention. So I try to do that in the morning.
Do you have, you must have some future projects going on, or things that you're planning that you could tell us about?
Well, yeah, I have a couple of novels. One is actually being shopped around right now. I have an agent in England who's sending it out, and so I'm, knock on wood, it's a difficult publishing environment, so I'm hoping that gets picked up. And that is a contemporary story set partly in Havana and partly in Nantucket. And then I'm working on something brand new right now, which means I can't talk about it too much, but other than to say it's it's a departure for me in that it takes place in the future, and the research, as opposed to a lot of the historical research I've done for other projects, the research for this one is mostly scientific.
And I saw that you have some audio versions of your works coming out?
Yes, actually, Willpoole's Island is going to be reissued in paperback in the fall of 2020, and in paperback and audio. And I'm sort of in the process of recording it, which is a really interesting process. So that will be out in 2020.
Circle back a little bit to, you mentioned about going out and skiing, and I know you live in Vermont where you can just put your cross-country skis on and go out the door.
Yeah.
The role of being in the outdoors
Yeah.
is so featured in really all of your writing, and you can just feel that it's a real integral part of you.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that and how it impacts your writing, perhaps, or your thought process.
Yeah, no, it definitely is a big part of my life. It is a form of sustenance. I feel a certain need to get out into the outdoors as much as I can. And it does figure largely in my writing, I think, in part because of what I mentioned before about the sort of transportive nature of place, the fact that you need to describe, if you describe a place, that allows you to transport the reader into the story, but also just because it's a personal preoccupation of mine. And I also feel, more and more these days that, we are sort of at a crisis point in the history of the human species. And part of that crisis is that we've become more separate from the network, the great network of life that has given birth to us and sustains us. And so, to the degree that that my fiction can contribute to keeping that connection alive, I'm happy about that. So all of those factors weigh in together to definitely to inform the fact that a lot of my writing does take place in wilderness settings and in nature.
And you've lived in interesting and wilderness areas, and as you said, you were always the new kid, moving and so on. So was nature somewhat a solace for you too? And
Yeah, absolutely.
some very cool places,
Yeah.
Colorado and Vermont and New Hampshire and
Yeah.
Central America, right? You said.
Yep. Central America, and more recently spending time in some of the more remote reaches of South America, Patagonia, Tierra del Fuego, those areas. So I do love to be outside.
Mm-hmm.
So.
In writing, are there some different writers that you admire or that kind of inspired you early on?
Yes, I mean there are many writers that inspire me, I guess I could talk about some of the ones that did long ago. I mean, one of the first writers that really inspired me was J.R.R. Tolkien. I think The Lord of the Rings is still a lasting work of literature that I love, and is very much place-based. He was also quite an outdoorsman. But Ursula K. Le Guin, Hemingway, Paul Bowles, Robert Stone, John Fowles, more recently writers like Hilary Mantel, Edith Wharton. I've been on a huge Edith Wharton kick. And most recently a book that is relevant to what we've been talking about, and that is The Overstory by Richard Powers, which is a really wonderful book that has kind of trees as its main focus and its main kind of setting and to some degree characters. So yes, I continue to be inspired by great novels and stories.
And with your teaching, you get
Yeah.
to interact with writers and aspiring writers?
I do. So I teach at Grub Street in Boston and at the Newport MFA, which is a really wonderful new low residency MFA program. And yes, I value it very much because of my ability to interact with other writers that are more or less in a similar place in their careers, and also writers that are up and coming, and just people who are passionate about the craft. It's wonderful to, writers most of us are to one degree or another, we're introverts. So when you get a bunch of writers together, interesting things can happen. And people do have a feeling of fellowship that arises when you're spending time with other writers, and I do value that quite a bit. Yeah.
Great. You said you started writing at how old?
Well, I mean, I was 6 when I wrote the great epic otter story that was 11 pages long.
Preordained.
But after that, I took a bit of a break. And it wasn't until in my mid to late 20s when I really came back to I was working with a lot of creative people. I was hiring a lot of creative people, writers, photographers, artists, for these educational programs. And I was like, wait a minute, I'm a writer, and so I decided to really apply myself and got an MFA and joined writers groups and really immersed myself in the craft. And ever since, that's what my life has been, the sort of focus of my life.
Perhaps The Otter can come back as a children's book now,
Maybe.
and
Maybe.
you can branch into another field.
Yeah.
You still remember that story?
I do. I think my sister typed it up, and I think I still probably have it somewhere. It's not very good.
Well, that's what editing comes in, right?
Right. Exactly.
Are there any things that we haven't had a chance to talk about you wanted to mention?
It's just happy to be here, and I can't say enough good things about the Cape Cod Writers Center. Really been a privilege to be interacting with the center and to have had a chance to teach there this summer, and I hope to return sometime in the future. So.
I hope you do. I
Yeah.
look forward to that.
Yeah.
And I just want to say that, I spent a career in education, so I think I know quite a few things about good teaching. And your class on fiction's inner landscape was in fact, the exercises you had us do, a number of them I actually plopped right into my next novel, like right from the class, and I was like, ooh, that can go right in there.
Well,
So
thank you, Rick.
Thank you for that.
No, it means a lot. It means a lot to hear that. I did enjoy the class, and it's great to have that kind of feedback. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I greatly enjoyed the conversation with
Me
you
too.
today, Tim. And I want to thank you for coming. And on behalf of the Cape Cod Writers Center, we hope to hear more from you and see more of your works. And also, see you again at one of the Cape Cod Writers Center's
Great.
conferences.
Thank you very
Okay.
much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.